Welcome back to the deep dive. We're here to unpack these, well, monumental shifts happening around us.
That's right.
And today, wow, we are diving into a really significant piece of legislation. It just hit the books, actually, on a very symbolic date, July 4th, 2025, signed by President Trump. It's nearly 900 pages, officially called the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or OBBA for short.
OBBA, yeah. And our job today really is to unwrap this thing. I want to look at its core goals, understand the, well, incredibly tight path it took through Congress,
Right.
and then trying to make sense of these wildly different economic forecasts that are swirling around it.
Wildly different is putting it mildly.
Yeah, we'll look at how it reshapes, everything, federal taxes, social programs, defense spending, even things like farming and energy policy.
So the goal is for you, listening, to walk away really understanding what's in this bill and, maybe more importantly, why it sparks such an intense, polarized national conversation. And when we talk about conflicting projections, it's a chasm, isn't it? The Trump administration is out there saying this bill cuts the deficit by over $2 trillion.
Right, that's their number.
But then you have the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, saying this thing increases the national debt by nearly $4 trillion over the next decade.
It's staggering. That's a nearly $6 trillion difference in what they think will happen.
So, okay, what is this OBBA fundamentally? What's this grand reimagining of government about?
Well, look, at its core, OBBA is really the centerpiece of President Trump's second-term domestic plan. You should think of it as a very deliberate, ideologically driven effort to reshape the whole financial structure of the U.S.
And the social contract, too, you mentioned.
And the social contract, exactly. It's a huge reallocation of where federal money goes, a statement of priorities.
Okay, let's break that down then. What are the big moves, the key pillars holding this thing up?
Okay, so there are several major shifts you really need to grasp. First, and this is huge, it makes the individual tax cuts from the 2017 law, the TCJA.
Right, the Trump tax cuts.
Those are now permanent. That's number one. Second, it brings in a bunch of new, though temporary, tax deductions.
Temporary. Okay.
Third, it really overhauls the social safety net. We're talking historic changes to Medicaid and SNAP food stamps, mainly by adding these new federal work requirements.
Oh, requirements, got it.
And finally, it directs just unprecedented amounts of new money towards national defense, building the border wall, and immigration enforcement.
So where's the money coming from for all this? It's not just appearing out of thin air, right? They must be cutting somewhere else.
No, definitely not. It's financed through, well, a combination.
Yeah.
Cuts to those social programs we just talked about, Medicaid, SNAP, and this is critical, rolling back a lot of the clean energy incentives.
From the previous administration's Inflation Reduction Act.
Exactly. Those are largely gone.
Yeah.
So if you step back, the big picture is roughly $4.5 trillion in tax cuts, offset by about $1.2 trillion in cuts to social programs, and then adding around $350 billion in new spending on defense and immigration.
Wow.
So yeah, it's taken from one pot to fill another. Very clear winners and losers written into the budget itself.
That is a huge reshaping of federal spending, which leads to the obvious question. In today's, incredibly polarized world, how did a bill this massive, this ambitious, actually pass?
Yeah, good question. Its passage really boils down to the 2024 elections. The results gave the Republican Party what's called a trifecta.
Meaning control of the White House, the Senate, and the House. All three.
All three. And that unlocked a very specific, very powerful procedural tool.
Which was budget reconciliation, right? Can you just quickly explain what that is for folks?
You got. Budget reconciliation is basically a legislative fast track. It lets certain budget-related bills, like OBBBA, get around the Senate's usual filibuster rule.
The 60-vote threshold.
Exactly. So instead of needing 60 votes, it only needed a simple majority, 51 votes, to pass the Senate, which meant, crucially, it could become law without a single Democratic vote.
And it did.
And it did.
That sounds like it required incredible party discipline, especially with wafer-thin majorities. How'd they keep everyone in line?
Oh, it was a major test of leadership. You had House Speaker Mike Johnson, Senate Majority Leader John Thune, really working it. And President Trump himself was deeply involved, very active.
Pushing hard.
Pushing very hard. He set this firm July 4th deadline for signing it. And lawmakers, well, they understood that stepping out of line could be politically dangerous. There was the example of Senator Tom Tillis.
In North Carolina.
Yeah. He initially voiced some opposition to the health care cuts in the bill. President Trump called him out publicly, very sharply, and soon after, Tillis announced he wasn't running for re-election.
Wow. Clear warning shot.
A very powerful warning to anyone else thinking of defecting.
And obviously it worked. The bill passed 5150 in the Senate.
with Vice President J.D. Vance breaking the tie.
Right. And then 218, 214 in the House, just razor thin. But even with that trifecta control, surely there had to be some horse trading, some compromises to get those last few votes.
Oh, absolutely. Even with unified control, you still need pretty much every single vote when the margins are that tight. So yeah, concessions were made.
Like what?
Well, for example, to get Republicans from high-tax states on board, think New York, California, they quadrupled the cap on the state and local tax deduction, the SALT cap.
Ah, that's always controversial.
Always. They raised it to $40,000, but only for 5 years, and only for people earning under $500,000.
Okay, a targeted fix.
Right. And Senator Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, she secured some state-specific exemptions from the tougher Medicaid and SNAP rules. That was key to getting her vote.
So with the bill basically unstoppable, what could the Democrats even do?
Their strategy shifted. They couldn't stop it, so they focused on procedural resistance and making a very public case against it, really setting the stage for future elections.
Like filibustering with speeches.
Yes, exactly. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries gave this marathon speech, nearly 9 hours long, calling the bill an immoral document, trickle-down cruelty.
9 hours.
And in the Senate, Chuck Schumer made the clerks read the entire bill aloud, all 887 pages. Took almost 16 hours.
Wow. Just to slow it down and highlight it.
Precisely. Not to stop it, but to create this very public record of opposition. They hammered the theme that it was a historic transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich.
Which really brings us back to the numbers game. Because as we said at the top, this bill generated this tale of two baselines for the debt and deficit.
It really did. You've got the CBO, the official scorekeeper, projecting the OBBBA will add over $3.9 trillion to the national debt between now and 2034.
$3.9 trillion.
Yeah, and that includes almost $700 billion just in extra interest costs because of the increased borrowing. Their math is basically $4.5 trillion in tax cuts, another $300 billion in new spending, offset only partially by $1.5 trillion in spending cuts.
And watchdog groups think it could be even higher.
Some do, yeah. Groups that track fiscal policy suggest the real cost could be another $1 trillion higher if those temporary tax cuts we mentioned get extended later on, which is often what happens politically.
Okay, so that's the CBO. And the White House projection is, well, the complete opposite.
Completely. The White House is claiming a deficit reduction of more than $2 trillion over that same time frame.
How do they get there? That's a massive difference.
They use what's called dynamic scoring, which means they don't just tally up the direct costs and savings. They build in assumptions about how much the economy will grow because of the bill.
Ah, the economic feedback effects.
Right. They argue that tax cuts and deregulation will unleash this huge economic boom, generating way more tax revenue than the CBO predicts. They also claim massive, unprecedented savings from eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse.
Which are harder to pin down.
Much harder to quantify independently. And the administration has been very dismissive of the CBO, even calling it the crooked budget office with a terrible record. It really highlights how politicized even economic forecasting has become.
So let's talk about that growth. And who benefits? The proponents had some pretty bold claims, right? A blue-collar boom.
Oh, yeah. The White House Council of Economic Advisors, their projection was for a long-term GDP boost of somewhere between 4.6% and 4.9%. And they claimed annual wage increases of $4,000 to $7,200 per worker. Really rosy stuff.
And other groups.
The Tax Foundation, which is generally seen as center-right, had a more modest forecast. They projected about a 1.2% increase in long-run GDP. Still positive, but much smaller.
But then the critical analyses from places like CBO and others paint a starkly different picture about who actually gains and who loses.
Yes, very different. The CBO looked at the House version and basically concluded that when you combine the tax cuts and the benefit reductions, the wealthiest households gain, on average, about $12,000 a year in resources.
Okay. And the poorest?
The poorest households would actually lose about $1,600 a year on average.
For the resources, wow.
And the Tax Policy Center, another nonpartisan group, looked ahead to 2026. They projected the lowest income group would get a pretty small tax break, maybe $150. The middle group, around $50, $150. But the top fifth, a substantial $10,950 average tax cut.
So that's where the upward transfer of wealth criticism comes from.
Exactly. Critics jumped on those numbers, calling it the largest upward transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich in American history. A very strong condemnation.
Okay, that's powerful context. Let's dig into the specifics of the tax changes. What's actually different for you, the individual taxpayer listening right now?
All right, the absolute cornerstone, the biggest piece for individuals, is making those 2017 TCJA tax cuts permanent. The lower rates, the different brackets, the nearly doubled standard deduction.
That was all set to expire at the end of 2025.
Right. So making them permanent prevents what supporters call a massive tax increase that would have hit millions. That's the main thing.
And the SALT deduction cap. That affects people in high-tax states.
Yeah, that was that compromise we mentioned. The cap was temporarily quadrupled, up to $40,000, but only for 5 years, and only if your income is under $500,000. So help, but limited help.
What about families? The child tax credit is always a big one.
It is. It's permanently increased to $2,200 per child. Now, that's up from where it was before 2017, but it's actually less than the $2,500 the House originally proposed.
And how it's structured matters too, right? For lower income families?
Critically.
Yeah.
The way the refundability part works means that some of the lowest income families, even with kids, won't actually get the full $2,200 credit. They won't owe enough taxes to benefit fully.
Okay. And then there were those new sort of unique pro-worker deductions you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, these are interesting. They introduced temporary deductions, and temporary is the key word here for income from tips.
Capped at $25,000.
Capped at $25K, right. Also a deduction for overtime pay and for the interest you pay on certain car loans.
And one for seniors.
Yeah, a new $6,000 deduction, specifically for seniors who earn less than $75,000. But again, important to stress, these popular ones are set to expire in 2028.
Along with that SALT cap increase.
Exactly. Oh, and the estate tax, the death tax, as opponents call it. The exemption amount, the amount you can leave to heirs tax-free, is permanently increased to $15 million per person, and it'll adjust for inflation. That prevents it from dropping back down significantly as it was scheduled to do.
Okay, so that covers individuals mostly. What about businesses and investments?
For businesses, the big things are making permanent two provisions from the 2017 law. Full expensing, which lets businesses immediately deduct the cost of new equipment.
Instead of depreciating it over time.
Right, and the deduction for research and development expenses. Proponents argue these are absolutely vital for encouraging companies to invest and grow.
Any other business changes?
Yeah, one interesting one is an increased tax on the investment income of large, wealthy, private university endowments. The idea there is to make sure those institutions contribute more financially.
And this bill even brought in some totally new ideas, like these Trump accounts. What are those?
Yeah, that's a novel mechanism. Trump accounts are basically new tax-deferred savings accounts. The idea is that every American child born gets one, and the government puts in an initial $1,000 contribution.
Sort of like a starter savings account for everyone?
Exactly, designed to encourage savings from birth. There's also a new tax, a 1% tax on personal remittances, money sent by individuals from the U.S. to other countries. That's aimed purely at raising revenue.
Okay, going back to all these temporary provisions, the SALT cap, the worker deductions, there's been a lot of criticism calling this a fiscal gimmick. Why is that such a big deal?
It's a huge point of contention, yeah, because it's not just, clever accounting. Critics argue it fundamentally misrepresents the bill's long-term cost and sets up this future problem.
Oh, so...
By making popular tax breaks temporary, letting them expire on paper in 5 or 10 years, the official CBO cost estimate is kept artificially low in that initial 10-year budget window.
Because the cost disappears after the expiration date.
Exactly. It makes the bill look cheaper than it likely is. But politically, letting popular tax cuts expire is really hard, so it creates this fiscal cliff down the road.
Where a future Congress will face immense pressure to extend them.
Immense pressure. And if or when they do extend them, the true, much higher long-term cost gets added to the national debt. So fiscal analysts widely see this use of expirations as a deliberate gimmick to understate the bill's real fiscal impact.
Okay, this is clearly a massive tax overhaul, but it goes way beyond taxes, right? Into the social safety net. How does OBBA remake programs like Medicaid and SMP? These are lifelines for millions.
Yeah, this is arguably just as significant, if not more so, for many people. It's a major restructuring. You hear the American Hospital Association calling it the largest cuts in Medicaid history.
Whereas the White House says...
The White House frames it as protecting and strengthening the program by getting rid of waste, fraud, and abuse. But the changes are profound. For the first time ever at the federal level, the law puts in place a mandatory 80-hour-per-month work requirement.
For who specifically?
For able-bodied adults on Medicaid, generally between 19 and 64 years old, who don't have young dependent children, work 80 hours a month, or document an exemption, or lose coverage.
And it's not just the work rules. There are other hurdles being added too, making it harder just to stay enrolled.
Exactly. That's a crucial part. States now have to recheck the eligibility of people covered under the Medicaid expansion every 6 months. Previously, it was usually annual.
More paperwork, more chances to fall through the cracks.
Precisely. The bill also cuts back on retroactive coverage, meaning if there's a gap in your coverage, it's harder to get past medical bills covered. And the CBO projection here is stark.
What do they estimate?
They estimate that nearly 11 million Americans, somewhere between 10.9 and 11.8 million, will lose their health insurance by 2034 because of these changes.
11 million people. Is that mostly from the work requirements?
Actually, no. The CBO says the biggest driver of coverage loss isn't people failing the work requirement itself, but eligible people just getting tangled up in the new complex administrative burdens.
The chilling effect, or red tape you mentioned.
Exactly. People who are eligible but just can't navigate this system successfully. Though, there was one concession made, a $50 billion stabilization fund specifically to help struggling rural hospitals.
Were there also changes affecting Medicare or the Affordable Care Act, the ACA marketplaces?
Yes, a couple of significant ones. The bill makes it harder for low-income seniors to enroll in the Medicare savings programs, which help with out-of-pocket costs. CBO thinks maybe 1.3 million eligible seniors could lose or not sign up for those benefits because of the changes.
Which means higher costs for them.
Potentially thousands of dollars more per year. It also rolled back some of Medicare's new power to negotiate prescription drug prices. And for the ACA marketplaces, it tightens rules around special enrollment periods and adds stricter identity checks before enrollment, which is also projected to lead to more uninsured people.
Okay, what about SNAP, food stamps? Similar kinds of changes there.
Very similar themes, yes. The work requirement age for able-bodied adults without dependents, which already existed, is expanded. It used to go up to age 54, now it goes up to age 64.
So affecting older workers without kids.
Right. And maybe even more significantly, it introduces this totally new mechanism where states, starting in 2028, could actually have to share the cost of SNAP benefits if their payment error rates are too high.
Shifting financial risk from the federal government to the states.
Exactly. It's a big shift in responsibility. The CBO projects that these SNAP changes combined will cause about 3 million people to lose their food assistance benefit.
3 million people. And student loans. That affects such a huge group of Americans. Any changes there?
Oh, a dramatic overhaul on student loans.
Yeah.
Basically, all the existing income-driven repayment plans, IDR plans, including the relatively new and popular Save-EE plan, they're all eliminated.
Eliminated entirely. Replaced with what?
Replaced with a single new plan called the Repayment Assistance Plan, or RAP. But the analysis suggests this new RAP plan is significantly less generous than the plans it replaces.
Meaning higher monthly payments for borrowers.
Projected to mean significantly higher monthly payments for many typical borrowers, yes. The bill also completely eliminates the graduate PLUS loan program.
Which students use for masters or PhDs or law school.
Exactly. Getting rid of grad PLUS could make it much harder for people to afford graduate or professional degrees.
Okay, so we've covered taxes, the safety net. Let's shift to the third major pillar you outlined, this America First reallocation. Huge funding shifts towards defense, border security, energy. It sounds like a fundamental reprioritization.
It absolutely is. This part of the bill represents a really profound redirection of federal money, away from social programs, away from climate initiatives, and poured directly into President Trump's core America First agenda items.
Like the Department of Homeland Security.
DHS gets a massive boost. A historic appropriation of over $165 billion just through OBBA itself. Some analyses put the total new spending on Homeland and national security closer to $350 billion when you factor everything in.
What does that translate to on the ground for the border and immigration enforcement?
It means unprecedented funding levels. You're talking over $46.5 billion specifically allocated for building more border wall. Another $45 billion to dramatically expand migrant detention capacity. The goal is to have 100,000 beds available.
100,000 detention beds.
Yeah. And $30 billion more just for ICE operations, immigration and customs enforcement. This money is meant to support hiring 10,000 new ICE officers.
With signing bonuses.
With $10,000 signing bonuses to attract recruits. And it's all tied to the administration's stated goal of deporting up to 1 million people per year.
That's a massive expansion for ICE. What are the concerns being raised about that?
Well, civil liberties groups are sounding alarms. They warn this huge influx of cash will make ICE the most heavily funded federal law enforcement agency, potentially with a budget over $100 billion by 2029. They're worried about increased, quote, violent raids and a vast expansion of detention.
And on the defense side, The peace through strength aspect.
OBBA pumps $150 billion in new money into the Department of Defense budget. That includes specific pots of money like $29 billion for building more ships, $25 billion to replenish munitions stockpiles, and another $25 billion for the Golden Dome missile defense system.
A signature Trump priority, that missile defense system.
Yeah, absolutely. All aimed at bolstering national security, according to the administration.
Okay, now let's turn to energy and environment, because this bill seems to actively reverse course on the green transition efforts of recent years.
It really does. It systematically takes apart the clean energy framework that was built by the Inflation Reduction Act under the previous administration.
How so? What specifically gets cut?
It repeals or speeds up the phase-out of a whole range of clean energy tax credits. Things like the popular tax credit for buying electric vehicles that's gone after September 2025.
So very soon.
Very soon. Also, credits for installing home EV chargers, for making energy-efficient home upgrades, credits that help finance new utility-scale wind and solar power projects, those are also phased out.
So it's cutting support for renewables, but is it also actively promoting fossil fuels?
Yes, it does both. It cancels planned increases in the royalty rates companies pay to drill for oil and gas on federal lands. It actually lowers the royalty rates for coal mining. And it creates a brand new tax break specifically for metallurgical coal, which is used in steelmaking.
Any exceptions? Any green energy support left?
The main one is for biofuels. There's an extension of a tax credit for biofuels production, the 45Z credit, running through 2031. That was seen as a specific win for the agricultural lobby.
What's been the reaction to these energy changes?
Intense. Environmental groups have called OBBA the most anti-environment bill in history. They warn it'll stifle investment in clean energy, lead to job losses in that sector, increase greenhouse gas emissions, and basically surrender U.S. leadership in green technology.
Didn't Elon Musk weigh in too?
He did, very strongly. He called the energy provisions utterly insane and destructive. He argued it damages the industries of the future while giving handouts to industries of the past. Strong words.
Okay, that leads us nicely into agriculture, which seems to have this really complex, almost contradictory impact from the bill. You mentioned a dual approach.
Yeah, it's a fascinating dynamic and kind of paradoxical. On one hand, the bill provides really substantial new financial support and tax relief for farmers and ranchers.
Okay, helping farmers.
But on the other hand, it imposes those significant cuts and new restrictions on the nutrition assistance programs, like SNAP. And SNAP recipients are actually a huge market for the food that farmers produce.
So it helps farmers with one hand and hurts their customer base with the other.
In a way, yes. Let's look at the direct support first. There's major tax relief. That 20% pass-through deduction for businesses, made permanent, that helps a lot of farmers. Increased Section 179 expensing lets them write off equipment costs faster. That benefits almost all farms.
And the estate tax change helps family farms too.
Hugely. Raising the exemption to $15 million permanently protects an estimated 2 million family farms from potentially having to sell off land or assets to pay the estate tax, the death tax.
What about direct farm subsidies?
There is what supporters are calling the largest investment in agriculture in decades through the Farm Safety Net programs. This means increasing the reference prices used to calculate payments for major crops like corn, soybeans, wheat. That part alone was over $65 billion in the Senate version.
Plus the biofuel support you mentioned?
Plus the biofuel tax credit extension and some protectionist measures for ethanol. So a lot of direct help for producers.
But then there's the contradiction you pointed out. Explain that tension again.
Right. The USDA, the Department of Agriculture, traditionally has this dual mission: support farmers and support low-income consumers through nutrition programs. OBBA heavily favors the producer side.
By cutting SNAP while boosting subsidies?
Exactly. By boosting farm income supports while simultaneously cutting the food purchasing power of millions of SNAP recipients, it prioritizes one group over the other. It kind of ignores the economic reality that SNAP benefits flow directly back to food retailers and ultimately to farmers. SNAP is a huge revenue stream for agriculture.
So it seems more like political calculation than, say, a holistic food system strategy.
That's how many analysts see it, yes.
Yeah.
Prioritizing the perceived needs of one core constituency over the interconnectedness of the whole system.
Okay, so we've walked through the major components. Unsurprisingly, the public reaction and the political fallout from this massive bill were immediate and intense, right? It didn't exactly bring people together.
Oh, not at all. If anything, it deepened the divides. It just intensified the arguments we were already having, reflecting just how polarized the country is.
How did the supporters react? The White House, Republicans in Congress?
They celebrated it as a landmark achievement, a historic victory. They framed it as fulfilling promises made during the campaign. You heard phrases like the largest middle-class tax cut in history, permanent border security, massive military funding, and restoring fiscal sanity. President Trump himself proclaimed it would launch a new golden age for America.
And the opponents, Democrats, advocacy groups, equally strong reactions.
Absolutely, just as forceful, but in the opposite direction. Democrats slammed it as a big, ugly bill full of trickle-down cruelty. Advocacy groups were scathing across the board.
Like the ACLU.
The ACLU called it the most harmful bill to pass Congress in a generation. They argued it takes an axe to Medicaid, specifically to fund abusive deportation efforts.
And healthcare groups, environmental groups.
The American Hospital Association warned about devastating impacts on people's ability to get health care. And as we heard, environmental groups flat out called it the most anti-environment bill in history. Just across the board, condemnation from the left and center-left.
What about public opinion polling? How did everyday Americans feel about it as it was being debated and passed?
Well, Pew Research Center did polling right before it passed. It showed pretty significant public skepticism. Nearly half of Americans, 49%, opposed the bill outright. 54% believed it would have a mostly negative effect overall. And 59% specifically said they thought it would hurt lower-income people.
But I assume that broke down along party lines.
Oh, drastically. The partisan divide was huge. 56% of Republicans favored the bill. But among Democrats, an overwhelming 80% opposed it. Really stark polarization.
I said this bill hasn't settled anything. It's clearly just reshaped the battle lines for the future.
Absolutely. It's redrawn the political landscape.
Yeah.
Democratic leaders have already made it clear. They plan to make the cuts to Medicaid and SNP a central theme in the 2026 midterm elections. So the fight over implementing this bill and its consequences is going to be a primary political battleground for years to come.
So wrapping this all up, what does this really mean for you, for the country? OBBA isn't just another budget law, is it? It feels much bigger, more foundational.
It absolutely is. You should think of it as a truly foundational legislative act. It hasn't resolved debates, it's sharpened them. And its lasting legacy, I think, will likely be defined by three really critical long-term transformations.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, it establishes a fundamentally new fiscal baseline for the country. By making those huge 2017 tax cuts permanent and adding, according to the CBO, trillions to the national debt, well, it basically locks in a lower revenue environment for the federal government for the foreseeable future.
Which means
Future debates about funding everything else, especially the big entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare as they face solvency challenges, are going to be much, much tougher. The fiscal constraints are tighter.
Okay, that's the fiscal baseline. What's the second big transformation?
Second, it really works to redefine the American social contract. Putting in those federal work requirements, adding all those new administrative hurdles for Medicaid and SNP, that's a major ideological shift.
How so?
It moves away from a model where benefits are largely based on your status, being low income, being elderly, having a disability, towards a more conditional model. Now, receiving aid is increasingly contingent on your behavior, like working, and your ability to successfully navigate a complex bureaucracy. That fundamentally changes the relationship between vulnerable citizens and the government.
And the third lasting transformation?
The third one is this massive reprioritization of national power, expressed through the budget. OBBA codifies a huge shift of federal resources away from areas like social welfare, healthcare, and climate change.
And
directs them squarely towards immigration enforcement, border control, and modernizing the military. It essentially translates the America First political doctrine into hard dollars and cents. And that has profound, long-lasting consequences for what American society looks like and how the U.S. engages with the world.
You know, what's really fascinating to me, thinking about this whole thing, is how the process itself, the way this bill was made, jammed through reconciliation with zero bipartisan support, might be just as important as what's actually in it.
That's a great point. The process itself could be a key part of its legacy.
Right. So beyond all the specific policies we've discussed, what are the long-term implications when major nation-shaping policy gets decided by the absolute narrowest of margins without any real broad consensus? How might that affect the ongoing debate about what role government should even play in American life?
That's the question to chew on, isn't it? What does it mean for the future when policy swings so wildly based on who holds the slimmest majority? It's something we'll likely be grappling with for a long time.